The US's imperial ambitions know no bounds. From overthrowing the government of Venezuela to regime change in Russia and China, Washington has cast its net across the entire globe. And the US has attempted to carry out a one-sided trade war with China, which has backfired. And now the nuclear arms race has thrusted back on the international stage, with Washington testing hypersonic nuclear missiles and ballistic missiles, claiming it's just part of testing its nuclear arsenal on an equal basis with Russia and China. And even as it tries to achieve its goals, there are signs that the US's power is beginning to fade globally and is being challenged around the world. Joining me to discuss the big picture today is Rachel Blevins. Rachel is an independent journalist from Texas who covers war and geopolitics. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
We've been wanting to have you on for a while, Rachel, and I'm always impressed with your geopolitical analysis. So let's start the topic with nuclear testing, nuclear weapons testing right now, which we're seeing the US is supposedly modernizing its nuclear arsenal, including developing new warheads for its upcoming LGM-35A Sentinel ICBM and Trident II D5 missile and the new B61-13 gravity bomb and other long-range hypersonic missiles. Yes, it's a mouthful, but Moscow says it will respond in kind to nuclear tests by any country. So what can you tell us about this nuclear arms race, considering neither the US or Russia has detonated a nuclear bomb since the early 90s?
Yeah, this nuclear arms race is getting extremely concerning. I would say that is the biggest takeaway, right, from all of the different weapons that they're looking at. And we have to remember that we are just a few months away from the last remaining nuclear treaty between the US and Russia expiring. The New START treaty is set to expire on February 1st of 2026. And Russia has made attempts to get the US to extend it. They came forward in recent weeks and offered one more year, essentially one more year to really get negotiations started so that we could come up with a new version of this treaty. They've even thrown it out there that, hey, let's include China in this treaty, and the US has not agreed to it. And so it's very concerning when you see some of the comments that President Trump has made going, oh yeah, we're going to go back to nuclear weapons testing, as if he's announcing what he's going to have for lunch today, right? As if he does not fully grasp what kind of a situation we could be in, especially if we see the US and Russia really going to a full-on nuclear arms race. And I know that Trump is a bit jealous, right? He's been keeping an eye on Russia. He knows that they have announced multiple nuclear-powered weapons in recent months, talking about the Oreshnik, of which we have only started to really see Russia roll it out. And then the Burevestnik, which is just this insane weapon that is the first of its kind, right? Russia's telling the world that, hey, we could send this up into the sky and you would not know it. You would have no idea. It could be flying around for days before it hits its target. Oh, and guess what? There are no limits to it. So I think what we're seeing right now with the Trump administration is they don't want to be outdone by Russia. And so that's why they're trying to kind of make it look like they are really the top dog. They're going, okay, what can we roll out on our end? And as I'm kind of watching this heat up, it just does not feel like it can go anywhere good at the end of the day, right? We see as you have Ukraine in this position where you're watching Kiev's defensive lines really start to fall apart. Russia has engaged in a war of attrition. Their war is not for just territory in Ukraine. Their war is for the overall defeat of the Ukrainian military, which is essentially the defeat of NATO when you look at the fact that NATO is the one backing Kiev's forces. And so when you're in the situation that we're currently in and that we're really kind of getting into in the next few months, as you start to see Kiev's forces crumbling, then you start to see real concerns about whether we could see a false flag attack that would draw NATO further into this war in Ukraine. And so that's when I start to get concerned going, okay, yes, we have seen talks happening here and there, but could we see the potential for a false flag? And could that then lead to the potential for even more nuclear weapons testing, especially as this treaty is set to expire? And where does that leave us? Because we all know that when it comes to nuclear war, there is no winner, right? We're talking about the end of civilization as we know it. And it is a very dangerous game that we're watching the Trump administration engage in. And they don't seem to be taking the warnings that Russia is throwing out there, right? Russia's trying to warn them, you do not want to mess with us. And it doesn't seem like there's anyone in the US government who is really taking it seriously right now.
And it's so devastating just to see the history of nuclear weapons testing in places like the Marshall Islands, for example, where the US completely devastated an entire people. And now, until now, they are literally living with so many cancers and diseases, all rooted from that nuclear testing by the United States. And so I think a lot of people forget what this really means for the environment as well, and for where the US tests out these nuclear weapons. And from my understanding, they will be testing these nuclear weapons near the Marshall Islands again. I mean, it's pretty grotesque. But I want to talk more about Ukraine. You touched on a lot of really interesting points, because I wanted to kind of segue into Ukraine. Zelensky, obviously, in the past month has been begging Washington for these new ballistic missiles. And so how does this nuclear arms race play into what's happening in Ukraine? I know you mentioned a little bit, but if you can expand on that more.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been interesting to kind of watch the way that the Trump administration has handled the war in Ukraine, because of course Trump came in campaigning on the promise that he was going to end this war. And anyone paying attention to his rhetoric on the campaign trail wasn't exactly getting their hopes up. They knew that that wasn't going to happen, because his version of solving things seemed to be that we're going to get Putin and Zelensky in a room together, they're going to hash it out, and then we're going to solve this war. Whether he was naive, whether he knew what he was doing, that's up for debate. But what we've seen is that even though there have been direct talks between the US and Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, that hasn't led to any meaningful agreements. And so, as we knew would be the case all along, Russia continues to focus on the battlefield. And what we're seeing right now is really fascinating, because we have this massively long front line. And Russia came out a couple of weeks ago and they told the world that, look, we have around 10,500 Ukrainian troops encircled in two key points, one of them being in Pokrovsk, which is in the Donetsk Republic, which is one of the regions that Russia sees as part of the Russian Federation following a referendum that was held back in 2022. The other area is in Kupiansk, which is actually in the Kharkov region, which Russia actually sees as part of Ukraine. So it's interesting to kind of see the territory that they are taking, the advances that they are making, that is right now going beyond just the 4 additional regions that they see as part of Russia. But Russian officials come out, they say, hey, just to let you know, we've got all of these troops encircled. Essentially, we can kill them all. They can surrender, right? You're not really giving us any good options here. And if you look at what Zelensky and the top Ukrainian officials said, they all denied it, right? They said, oh, that's not the case. They're not fully encircled, right? They just continue to be detached from reality. And then we continue to watch Russia make advances. We continue to watch them telling the world that, hey, the number of troops here are dwindling, right? We are being forced to essentially kill these guys that are here in this area as they are trying to take more territory. And so going back to your question, when we're looking at what Zelensky is asking for, he wants long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles. And this has been one of those things that has been on Zelensky's wish list for years now, along with Abrams main battle tanks, F-16s, right? It's just kind of the whatever the toy of the moment coming from the US. But if you look at the Tomahawks, the possibility that the US could introduce them into the conflict, one of the main things we have to remember is that the US military would be the ones carrying out the attacks with the Tomahawks. Because of the technology, this is not something they can just hand off to the Ukrainians and be like, oh, here, you guys have fun with this. go destroy some Russian targets. The other thing is that if they were to introduce in Tomahawks, this would be about carrying out attacks within Russia, right? We're talking about attacks targeting Moscow and targeting various other cities. This wouldn't have anything to do with the front lines. So, yeah, the US can introduce in the Tomahawks, they can carry out these attacks, but that's not going to change the balance of power on the front lines. And that's one thing that we've seen Putin mention multiple times now, that, hey, you would just be increasing tensions between the US and Russia. You wouldn't actually be addressing the manpower shortages or the weapons shortages that Ukraine is currently dealing with. So the fact that Zelensky is lobbying so hard for these Tomahawks, you have to wonder, right? You have to look at him and go, wait a second, your goal here, you claim, is to take back all of this territory, to get Ukraine back to the borders of the 1990s, but you're not actually pursuing that. You're just pursuing a weapon that would further increase tensions. Oh, and actually, when you look at the Tomahawks, they're also capable of holding nuclear warheads. So if you're in Russia, if you're sitting in Moscow and you look up at the radar system and you've got a Tomahawk flying towards your capital, how do you know that it has a nuclear warhead or that it doesn't? That could put Russia in a very dangerous situation of trying to figure out how to respond and what do they do, and that could further launch us into the possibility of nuclear warfare. And so going back to the ways in which Russia has really tried to warn the US, you don't want to do this, it reminds me of the warnings that we've been getting from Russia for years now when it comes to the situation in the Donbass, when it came to the pre-2022 era, when you had Kiev's forces targeting all of these ethnic Russians in the Donbass who simply said, look, we do not want to live under Kiev's rule now that you have overthrown the government there. And they fought for their territory for many years before Russia got directly involved. And Russia tried so hard, right? They issued all of these warnings to the US. And it's interesting because I know on social media there's always a lot of talk, and I'll get people that'll say, oh, well, that's just Russian propaganda. And I'm like, no, if you look at the statements that you're getting from these Russian officials, they are practically begging the US to work with them, begging them not to take it a step further. And yet we continue to see the US take it further. And so that's definitely something that I'm going to be keeping an eye on as we start to watch Russia not only gain more ground in terms of territory in some of these key locations, but also completely wipe out what is left of Kiev's military, of their defensive lines, because they are not in a good position right now. And there doesn't seem to be anything that NATO, that the US in particular, are doing, any solutions that they're coming up with to help Kiev out. Instead, their quote unquote solutions are, let's, funnel more money into this endless military industrial complex, acting like we're solving things, or let's, send more dangerous weapons into Russia and possibly spark even more conflict.
Well, it's so interesting that you said, when we talk about these things, that the statements that have come out of Russian politicians and spokespeople, they have been warning the United States. And it's really simple. You just have to go on the NATO-funded think tanks' websites like the Atlantic Council, who are cheering on this Cold War against Russia. They want a nuclear arms race with Russia. They want this confrontation. We're seeing that with what the United States has done inside of Ukraine to ignite this conflict. And then anytime you provide with an alternative perspective, they just kind of just label you as a Russian agent, or you're just spewing Russian propaganda. But it just takes like 2 seconds to compare and contrast what's coming out of the think tanks that are funded by NATO, like the Atlantic Council, which, if you go on there right now, one of their top articles from the last year is a push to arm Kiev with more weapons. They're pushing that. And we have to remember that this is the war that the neoliberals want, and the neocons want as well. And so I want to just call on everybody now. We're just going to switch gears to the US trade war with China. But before we get into the next question, I want to remind everybody that MintPress News is an independent investigative media outlet, and we're almost about to hit 100,000 YouTube subscribers. So If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit like to increase the engagement and leave a comment on this video. And so, Rachel, both you and I were Americans, and we are watching our government, our country, carrying out a one-sided trade war against China right now, but with little success. It's actually backfired. The tariffs have jacked up prices here in the US. Washington failed to crush Chinese tech giants. China is supposedly winning this AI race, and American farmers in general are feeling the pinch as their biggest customers are disappearing. When I go out shopping, I will tell you right now that prices are up. So to what extent is this trade war blowing up in Washington's face and in the face of the average American?
Yeah, I feel like I'm spending more than ever and yet not getting nearly as much in return. And I know that that is the story that just about every American is feeling right now, especially when you're going to the grocery store. And yeah, we knew kind of what to expect from Trump. Like he campaigned really hard on the promise of tariffs. And then he comes into office and his tariff policies have just given me a headache, right? We'll have one day where he's like, it's Liberation Day, we're putting tariffs on everybody. And then the next day, he's rolling back half of those tariffs because he essentially just wants all of the world leaders to come to Washington and beg him to work with them. And then he'll go, oh, okay, I'll make a deal with you. Like that seems to be his main goal here. And when it comes to China, we also knew that they have been watching Trump for years now. They dealt with him during his first term. And so they weren't just sitting around doing nothing, hoping that Trump would be nice to them. No, they had things pretty queued up in the sense that they know where their dominance lies. And that is, of course, with rare earth minerals, because China controls 90% of the refining of rare earth minerals in the entire world. So, yeah, the US, you can see these various reports where they talk about places where they're finding rare earth minerals. Yeah, they're still shipping those rare earths off to China to get them refined to then fully use them. And even the reports I've seen in the commentary from the Trump administration acting like they're going to come up with some sort of a solution to this, well, that's all fine and good, but that's still years down the road. So China knew kind of where their power was. They also knew that all they had to do was pull back on, simple things like soybean purchases from the US, and that could be a bargaining chip that they could use with Trump later on to go, oh yeah, we'll buy some more soybeans, don't worry. But what Trump didn't seem to realize was that China was all fine and good to allow him to try to claim a win, right? For Trump to put all of these tariffs on China to get them to over 100%, and then to go meet with Xi Jinping and to come back and to say, oh, yeah, I won because he got a portion of the tariffs removed by the fact that Xi was willing to quote unquote back down also when, as you were noting, this is a one-sided trade war. China didn't want this to begin with. But when it comes to the rare earths, that's particularly interesting because the US military relies heavily on the rare earths coming from China, of course. And so I was reading a report earlier, and the publication is not coming to mind. I want to say it was the Wall Street Journal, but they were talking about how they were saying that, oh, China has this new scheme where they are, really ramping up the export licenses for average companies that want to work with their rare earths, but they're slowing it down and putting all of these blocks on ones that are related to the US military. Because obviously, if you're Beijing and you're looking at the US trying to mount some sort of proxy war against you, say in Taiwan, then you are not going to be like, oh yeah, let's send all of these rare earths to the US military and help them out. No, you're going to take whatever steps you can to try to prevent that from happening. And so I think the Trump administration is kind of starting to realize the power that China has over them. I know they all have this dream of the US decoupling from China. I do think that they are going to take steps in the future to work towards that. I think that, war against China is one of their long-term goals. But I think that this year has also served as a reality check for the US that, look, we are not there yet. So all of those hawks in Washington that dream of war against China by 2027 are having to realize that the US can pursue that, but we're not going to have the weapons. We're not going to have the technology. Oh, and all of those prices here at home are going to skyrocket because if we're pursuing a war against China, the first thing that they're going to do is cut us off from all of the cheap imports we're relying on here in the US. And so a little bit of a reality check for now, although I can't say that I trust the Hawks in Washington to focus on any sort of logic long term. And I am worried about what they're going to try to pursue after they get through all of the other wars and conflicts that are just a little bit higher up on their list.
And we are now seeing, this closer alliance between Russia and China and Iran more than ever. They just keep getting closer and closer. The more they get isolated, the more the U.S. pushes confrontation with these three nations, the closer they get. And could you speak a little bit more about this new partnership that has really developed in the last few years? And how do you see it moving forward, considering the United States is pushing for more confrontations, but also having a reality check, like you said, that a war with any of these three countries would be catastrophic?
I think the US really went in a bit too far when it came to Russia, right? They seem to think that if they announced this proxy war against Russia, right? If they announced that they were going to do everything in their power to make Russia the most sanctioned nation in the world, that every other country would just kind of follow along. That seemed to have been their goal, maybe that of the Biden administration back in 2022. But instead, that has backfired. And as you were noting there, right, Russia, China, Iran, they have all gotten closer than ever. And I think they've all realized a very important lesson, which is, yes, the US is willing to do that. I mean, we may have thought previously that the US would just pick on smaller countries, right? That it would pick on Iraq and Afghanistan and even now currently Venezuela, but that it wouldn't go as far as to pick on, say, a Russia or a China. And the US did that. And so now the rest of the world is having to learn the importance of truly creating this multipolar world, building it out and building their alliances with one another. And I think that kind of plays into the reality check that the US is getting when it comes to China, because it's like, okay, if you want to pursue a war against China, have at it. Do you think you're going to get Russia on board? Do you think that Russia is going to turn their back on China? No, absolutely not. And to that end, when it comes to Iran, when it comes to Venezuela, and all of these different conflicts that the US is trying to actively pursue, what we're watching is the multipolar world realize that they have to start to work together, right? They have to continue to strengthen these alliances. And it is tough, and I will admit I am both optimistic and cynical, right? I'm optimistic about the growing multipolar world that we're seeing, about all of these countries kind of waking up, realizing that there is strength in numbers, realizing that if they don't stand up to the US, then they could be the next one that is targeted. At the same time, I will say I'm a little bit cynical, right? When I look at the current situations, I mean, and obviously the genocide in Palestine has been at the forefront of this, right? This kind of realization that, yes, we have this growing multipolar world, but we also have issues when it comes to, okay, what are all of these countries going to do if you have a genocide that is being live streamed to the entire world, right? What is their solution for it? Because I know that Russia and China do love to focus on, the international system, the international laws. That's something that they take very seriously, and that's great, and I respect that. But if we have an ongoing genocide, international law isn't working for that. International law is not working quickly enough to save the lives of the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that have been massacred by Israel and by the US and by all of the other Western powers that have played a role. And so watching kind of this building US aggression towards Venezuela and towards Iran, we know that Russia and that China are going to provide the support that they can in a number of various ways. But we also know that there's only so much that they can do. There's only so far that they can go when it comes to that support. And a lot of it comes down to what Venezuela is going to be able to endure and what Iran is going to be able to endure. And I think that, we're coming up on the 1 year anniversary of the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And that is a case for caution when it comes to the multipolar world, I will say, because for years, Assad stood strong. For years, Assad did not fall. But then, seemingly overnight, he did. And the world kind of had to wake up to the fact that, when you look at Russia, you realize the US had it figured out. It knew that we get Russia busy in Ukraine. We have them, so busy over in Ukraine that they can't do as much for Syria. Oh, and then we get together our uprising of jihadis in Syria, and then we target the government that has already been hollowed out by years and years of US sanctions. And so I am incredibly concerned about the fact that the fall of Assad in Syria has really kind of emboldened the US to continue to carry out these quote unquote regime change wars in a number of different ways. And that's why we're now seeing this buildup in the Caribbean targeting Venezuela, right? That's why they've got various plans that they're trying to get together for Iran, just trying to figure out how Israel is going to survive that, if that's even possible. But yeah, so if that makes sense, I have kind of the cautious optimism, but I'm also still a little bit cynical, thinking that we have really a ways to go before the multipolar world gets to truly where it needs to be.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you touched up on Syria, because if we look at Syria as a case study, or even what happened in Gaza, or even what happened in Libya, or what we see happening today in Sudan, these are catastrophic human rights abuses that are taking place at the hands of US proxy wars. Okay, these are proxy wars that are warnings to these countries and to the global south that if you ditch the US dollar, if you resist, if you stand up to US imperialism and influence, and if you stand with Russia and China and Iran, your country will be regime changed. It will be, weapons will be poured in there, and famine will be used as a weapon of war. And so, looking at what's happening in Syria today, we did see that because of the US sanctions and the regime change operation that took place there, with the United States arming the jihadis through proxies, And we saw the fall of Bashar al-Assad. And so in that moment, that took away a huge ally for Russia and for Iran. And in the case of Sudan today, the sabotage that the United States has done inside of Sudan through its proxies, through the CIA, through Israel's Mossad, through Saudi Arabia, through Egypt, through the UAE, has been to push out any sort of influence from Iran, Russia, and China to have any stake inside of, Sudan, another African country. And you talked about the rare earth minerals. I mean, Sudan has a lot of minerals wealth. It has a lot of gold, and it has a lot of oil. And so the United States right now is plundering that through its proxies, and it's being, poured into the international market, and its roots at that point disappear. But we know that that's coming from the US war in Sudan by proxy. But I want to talk more about Syria, because just the most interesting thing is happening right now. Donald Trump recently met with Syrian interim president. By the way, he's an interim president who was never even elected, Ahmad al-Sharaa, where the two announced the lifting of sanctions on Syria, as well as a host of measures to bring Syria under close control of the US. The United States wants to build a military base near Damascus and pull Syria into the Abraham Accords. Pulling Syria basically out of the resistance camp to the assistance camp, right? And so this is completely symbolic. And before you answer this question, I want to play this video of al-Sharaa, who once had a bounty on his head for his role as a founding father of Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda branch inside of Syria, to now playing basketball with his former enemies, top US military commanders. Check it out. So Rachel, tell me what you thought about that.
Yeah, it really sums it up, right? You've got this guy who just went from having a $10 million bounty on his head to, as you were noting there, he's playing basketball with the guys who previously were supposed to be trying to kill him. And I love how the articles in the Western media, they point out, oh, he spent some time in U.S. custody, right? He spent some time with General David Petraeus, and they don't seem to want to ask any questions about how that would then, kind of help mold him into becoming the perfect U.S. puppet, which is exactly what he is today. I mean, he was paraded through DC. They made sure to drop him off at the IMF headquarters. That way he could, get some information on some predatory loans for Syria so that the US could further get the country under its grasp. And then he goes to the White House and he sits down with Donald Trump, shakes his hand, and then he, of course, has to go to Fox News and have an in-person interview. I feel like it's not quite a complete US visit unless you have that. But in that interview, I thought it was so interesting when they mention his past and they're like, oh, yeah, you were the leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria. And he's like, yeah, that's in the past. I didn't discuss that with Trump, right? Acting as if, oh, that was just something that happened in my school days. Not like, oh, I was the literal leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria. I was the literal prodigy of al-Baghdadi and ISIS. No. He's just, that was just a phase that he went through. Not to mention the fact that his quote unquote head chopping days are still continuing. As you were pointing out earlier, the current situation for the Syrian people is just horrific. You have minorities being targeted across Syria. You have al-Jawlani. I will say I refer to him as Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani more
I
than
do the same
anything.
thing.
Because that is I feel like that's the name that he would really want at the end of the day. But yeah, you have all of his foreign fighters, his death squads that have come into Syria, and it is just horrific to watch it play out and to watch the Trump administration bring him in, and they're just seeing the dollar signs, right? They're seeing the, oh, let's get you into, and isn't that ironic? Get this guy who is part of the Islamic State. I believe he still is at heart. He's now joining the anti-Islamic State coalition. Of course, that seems just fitting for him. And it's just a reminder of what the US was about in Syria the entire time. And they're feeling a little bit threatened, right? Because I know Russia is also looking at Syria. They've also had Jelani at the Kremlin. They've kind of wined and dined him a little bit while I think issuing some warnings to him that, look, you better keep an eye on the Russian forces at their specific bases that they have on the coast in Syria and make sure that nothing happens to them. But it is kind of interesting to watch him balancing the Russian interest, the American interest, the Turkish interest, the Israeli interest. And it's just a reminder that none of those interests are for the Syrian people. None of those interests are for the people who are being impacted by all of these policies the most. And it's incredibly concerning to me to watch the US really kind of tighten their grip on Syria, because I know that they still have their eye on a future war with Iran, and they also want to make sure that they are targeting the resistance movement as much as they possibly can, right? They feel like they have triumphed over the axis of resistance in a number of ways. And as we know, look, resistance cannot be defeated at the end of the day, right? It can be harmed, it can be hit, but it is not going to be defeated ultimately, and it will return. But it is also concerning to watch the ways in which the US and Israel are continuing these policies, and in some ways, it feels like no one is standing up against them, right? It feels like we are watching the US do what it wants. We're watching Israel certainly do what they want, right? As they have continued on with this genocide. And even as, there's supposed to be a ceasefire agreement in Gaza, this quote that, oh, yeah, the war is over, everything's good. And then now we look at Israel violating it on a daily basis, continuing to target the Palestinian people, continuing to carry out genocide and to target their access to humanitarian aid. And so it is concerning to me to watch the US empire and the direction that it is pursuing, because it's just a reminder that as long as it's able to keep doing this, it is going to do it, right? We see kind of little stops, right? We see China saying, look, no, we're not, you can have a trade war with us, but we're not going to engage in this. Here is our power. And then the US kind of backs off. You see, Trump going and talking to Vladimir Putin and realizing he's not going to get the full-on ceasefire that he wanted in Ukraine, sure. But then you also see Trump and the US kind of having their way in Syria and getting what they want out of it and destroying this country that the American people, I don't think they have any idea of the historic importance of Syria and the importance of the Syrian people altogether. And it's just like the US just looks at it as, oh, yet another, essentially another military base that they can control in the Middle East with their eyes on Iran, hoping for a future war there. And so it is concerning to watch the ways in which the US empire as a whole, in some ways, is learning some lessons, but there are still so many lessons that they need to learn. And I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying about the multipolar world and the fact that there are a lot of serious things that they need to figure out before we can ever achieve true multipolarity, before they're ever truly able to stand up to the US empire.
Will they learn though, Rachel? I mean, we have a Zionist, what is it called, chokehold on US politics here in the United States and in Washington. And so it seems like, the United States is not even making its own decisions anymore when it comes to the Middle East and in many places of the world. It's Israeli influence that is, targeting countries and creating the framework, I guess you could say, the architecture for a lot of these conflicts. I mean, that's just where I see things going. So unless we get a hold of this Frankenstein that we've created out of Washington, perhaps we can have some more self-reflection inside of Washington. And we can see how US policies have been splintering Europe. We can look at the case study of the Ukraine war and the Nord Stream pipeline bombing, for example. Quite apart from the huge economic toll it is taking, Poland now is refusing to extradite a suspect in the Nord Stream 2 bombings to Germany for prosecution, effectively ending any hopes of justice. And other European nations are pressuring Germany to drop the case entirely. So for my final question for you, Rachel, what does that say about the state of Europe, considering this investigation is splintering the continent? Is the continent as disunited as at any other time in recent memory? What do you think?
I think they're getting to that point. I think they still have a ways to go. But yeah, it's been interesting to watch this Nord Stream investigation because it comes up every several months, I would say, right? We get some new update and then you don't hear about it for a little bit and you kind of forget about it. And then it's like, oh yes. In this latest report, it's interesting because Germany has decided that they've got this group of a group of Ukrainians essentially that they say they are responsible, right? They are the ones who are behind this very sophisticated military bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline that, no, it's just your average Joes, essentially. And now they're pointing the finger at Poland saying, oh, well, Poland's the reason we can't continue with this because they've got this one guy and they refuse to extradite him because they see him as a national hero. But when you take a step back, we also have to remember the reporting. And I think that the reporting by investigative journalist Seymour Hersh is probably the most spot on that I've seen in this case, pointing to the fact that, look, this was a full-on military operation and that it was, really years in the works before it was carried out. And that this is not just a couple of Ukrainian guys on a yacht getting together, carrying out this very advanced bombing of the pipelines that were able to do it. But of course, when it initially happened, the focus was on Russia, and the West claimed over and over again that Russia bombed their own pipeline. You know, the pipeline that they just spent billions of dollars and years building, that they just got together and bombed it instead of simply turning off the gas like you would think that they would do if they wanted to end their work with Europe. But then they had to go to the next quote unquote logical option, which in their mind was Ukraine. They're like, obviously, yeah, Ukraine, they had every reason to hate the Nord Stream pipelines, to hate the fact that it was Russia sending cheap gas to Germany. We've got to cut that off. And so then that became their next story, their next prime suspect, while keeping all eyes off of the US. And yet, when you look at who has benefited from the bombings of the Nord Stream pipelines, it's the US, because now instead of buying cheap gas from Russia, Europe has to turn and buy much more expensive gas from the United States, which is exactly what they've done. And it's kind of crazy sometimes when you look at the situation in Europe and you go, they still don't get it. They still think that the US is for them. They still think that Washington is an ally that they can trust. And they are just completely oblivious to all of the ways in which the US has set them up to fail. One of the most recent is, of course, the fact that you have the Trump administration with this new scheme that, oh, we're not involved in the war in Ukraine anymore. We are outsourcing it to Europe. We are selling weapons to Europe. Europe's going to pay for them, and then they're going to transfer them over to Ukraine, basically putting it off on Europe that they are the ones directly involved in this proxy war against Russia, while the US is still providing the military intelligence sharing with Ukraine. So I don't know exactly how they expect that to work, but you look at Europe and you do see some splintering, right? You do see kind of an awareness, and I think we're starting to see a version of that. We've seen it in recent elections with the parties that are more question or are asking more questions about the war in Ukraine, about funding for the war in Ukraine, that they are starting to get more and more support, and that the establishment politicians in Europe are getting a bit of a wake-up call that, okay, we don't have public support fully in the way that we did back in, say, 2022, when they could just point the finger at Russia, say Russia's the bad guy, they invaded, and then everyone would throw in their votes to send as much money as possible to Ukraine. So I think we're getting to that point. I also think the US empire, while it feels like it has to be the top dog, I think that ultimately they're making a mistake by continuing to throw Europe under the bus. They don't want Europe to get too powerful. They certainly don't want an alliance between the EU and the UK and Russia, which is what they were so concerned about at the start of all of this, that they would see those quote unquote allies align with Russia and then turn against the US. But I think going back to what we were talking about when it comes to the growing multipolar world, when you have countries like Russia and China and Iran and, you know, even India to a certain extent was wanting to put aside some differences to work with China, to work with, or to continue to work with Russia. When you see those allies standing together, and then you look at the US and its vassal states in Europe that are falling apart, I think that the US is going to live long enough to regret putting Europe in that position, and to regret not having strong allies by being so focused on overall primacy, so focused on we have to be number one, everyone has to be below us, that they're not seeing the bigger picture and really the overall shifting on the world stage of what happens when you get multiple countries that are bigger players that go, hey, we think we can work together, and then they really start to take on the US.
Rachel Blevins, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure, and I've certainly learned a lot from you. You have a skill where you can just, share this information so eloquently and so calmly and collected. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And y'all be sure to give MintPress News a follow and get them to 100,000 subscribers.
Thank you.